Hey everyone, welcome to the Reimagining Restaurants podcast, where we talk to people on the front lines of the restaurant business trying to delight customers today while also giving lots of thoughts and doing the work towards building a restaurant for the future. Today's guest is Kevin Jeung, who is the chef of research and production at Restaurant Noma. And for anyone in the restaurant business and for many who just are living in the world watching shows like The Bear, you probably know that many see Restaurant Noma as the world's best restaurant. I had met Kevin in Japan after one of the Spoon members, Tiffany, aka my wife, met Kevin on a fermentation tour. She asked him to come to our event, the Smart Kitchen Summit Japan, and so I got to talking to him there, and I thought we really need to bring Kevin on the podcast. He was there for a pop-up for Noma, and while he's back in Denmark, he definitely has some thoughts on Japan's culinary scene. But I also wanted to ask him about how he got to where he is today, helping the world's greatest restaurant innovate and build towards the future. It's a great conversation, one I'm sure you'll love. And for those of you who listen to the Spoon podcast, if you haven't already subscribed to the Restaurants Reimagine podcast, this is an episode from that podcast that we've cross-published into the Spoon feed. And so if you like diving deep, if you like hearing about people building new things and innovating in the restaurant space, you're definitely going to want to subscribe. And as you probably know, we have lots of other great new podcasts, great new hosts as part of the Spoon Podcast Network, which we launched a couple weeks ago. So you're going to want to go to Spoon, check out our podcast, and subscribe. All right, that's it for now. Let's get to my conversation with Kevin. Tell us who you are and what you do.
All right, my name is Kevin Jeung. I am the chef of research and production at Restaurant Noma and Noma Projects in Copenhagen, Denmark. I'm responsible for not only the upkeep and daily production over on the restaurant side, but also making decisions and upscaling a lot of recipes that go towards the retail arm of the company now as well.
And we're going to dive into that a little bit because there was some fairly big news around Noma and what you do. But I want to start by getting a little bit of background and let folks know a little bit about you, Kevin. Mm-hmm. You've had an interesting journey through the culinary world. Ending up at Noma is a pretty great achievement because recognized by many as the best restaurant in the world. But how did you get from where you started to there?
Yeah, so it was in between 10th and 11th grade. I was on my 17th birthday, actually. I started a job at a local restaurant in Toronto. It's like a family restaurant. So I was a dishwasher only on Sundays because I still had school and had work and things like that as well. So I would wash dishes, and then you have the classic story of the prep cook showing up late or hungover or not showing up at all, and then you kind of start to move up the ranks from there. So it's ironic because Thomas Keller has a very famous story of how he learned to make hollandaise, and that was one of his formative moments. And hollandaise was actually the first recipe I learned outside of the dishwashing area at this restaurant. So I did 2 years at this very casual, like bar and grill type of restaurant, burgers and.
While still in high school, essentially.
Yes, while still in high school. And I graduated high school, and I was enrolled in the University of Toronto for English. And this was a decision that my parents were heavily influential in guiding me in that direction. I was a very good student. I graduated. Yeah. I had enough credits to graduate a semester early, just from all the extracurriculars and things that I did. So I got into University of Toronto. I took English because English was my highest grade in school, and I didn't want to be in university. I knew then I wanted to be a cook.
And you wanted to be a cook, but were you kind of doing what your parents wanted you to do? As a lot of us do, right? A lot of us are like, okay, we'll go to college for this. But you had your real passion, which was cooking.
Yeah, like I distinctly remember it was like a weekend. I was still in school, but my parents had kind of noticed that, once I stopped wanting to be a professional hockey player, like every Canadian boy, the next dream was to be a chef. And they took me out to a restaurant, and it was just me and them. And they said, look, you can do the food thing, but we want you to go to school first. We want you to be a doctor or a dentist. You can make the money, and then you can have the restaurant afterwards with the money that you make.
You can retire as a gentleman restaurant operator.
Mm-hmm. And I knew this is I was 14 years old or something like that. And I knew back then that that's not how this industry worked. I had done enough reading and seen and heard enough stories that I was like professionally cooking is not something you do when you're retired at the age of 55. Like, that's not when you usually start. Now, obviously there are exceptions. I don't want to group everything together, but for the most part, the key to the industry is starting very young and working your way up from there. So I went to university to appease them. I lasted 4 months. I spent more than my tuition on drinks and partying and booze. And then
essentially one semester.
Yes, exactly. One semester. And it was one semester because, one of my finals was on a day where the restaurant I was working at, this is the same restaurant, the first restaurant I started at, this is when they called me and said someone didn't show up for work and they needed me to work on the hotline. And at that time I was garde manger. So this is like an emergency promotion. And without any hesitation, I said, I'll be there. So I didn't go to the final or the midterm for my university.
Oh, wow.
I just didn't show up at all and I went to the restaurant. So what ended up happening was I realized if I could make a decision like that quickly and that confidently, then what was I doing with my time in university? So after that happened, I dropped all my courses and, I made it so it wasn't possible to pick up the credits again. And I didn't tell my parents. That was the key. It was like,
so that was obviously a little scary.
Yeah, it was one of those, I was going to tell them eventually. And then I don't, you're 18 years old, 17, 18 years old, and you post on Facebook, like, thanks everyone for all the good times, but I'm leaving university. It's been real fun and blah, 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 but I'm going to go pursue my goals of cooking or whatever. And you post that on Facebook, not thinking that your parents have friends who have kids who are your friends on Facebook, and they can talk to each other, and then they talk to my parents,
wow.
and then you get called downstairs at home, and they're like, so like our friend said that you posted this thing on Facebook about dropping out of university, and then so it made it a very difficult home situation at that point where because I knew my parents, I knew they were so persuasive and adamant that I do these things, that was one of the first big rebellions I ever did as a young person, and I knew with every fiber of my body that this is what I wanted to do, and I just had to believe in myself, even if it meant that it upset some people who were trying to guide me in what they thought was the right direction. I'm happy to say that they have come around. Like today they are my biggest fans. But back then it was just a little bit rocky because, I mean, I guess if you're a parent and your kid makes these decisions, and I was the oldest of my generation of like my cousins and stuff like that, and I had really good grades and scholarships and things like that. So it was maybe a bit jarring to them that I went from potentially having a very cushy white collar existence to wanting like a grease stained apron and a blue collar job. So
yeah, and it could be a tough life, but if it's your passion, they eventually accepted that. And so once that was set, you had that difficult conversation after the Facebook post.
Yeah.
What happened from there? Did you go to culinary school? Did you just learn in the kitchens? What happened?
So I went to the French Culinary Institute in Manhattan, and it doesn't exist anymore. ICE, or I guess I should say ICE now, because ICE has taken on a different meaning in today's news. But the International Culinary Education Center, they took over that school. So my school no longer exists, but like notable alumni are Bobby Flay, David Chang was a graduate of my school, Josh Skeens, formerly of Cezanne, was a graduate of my school. So the reason I chose this school as opposed to, obviously a lot of people go to the Culinary Institute of America, was the program at the FCI was only 6 months. And having just come out of one education system and now choosing to go into another, not to say I was disillusioned, but I was almost enlightened to the belief that you only learn so much in school, especially in a very practical industry like cooking. So I wanted a short program to learn as much as I could, as quickly as possible, and get myself into the field and start learning that way. And I did some short internships at Per Se and Gramercy Tavern. I kind of took advantage of having a student visa for the States, because notoriously it's very difficult to get work in America, especially early in your career when you don't necessarily have the resume to back up a visa application.
Were you working while you're going to school, or were you just going to school? Like, was that full time?
It was full-time school, and then with the little time that I had here and there, I would go in and slice cabbage at Gramercy Tavern for 4 hours or something like that. Like, it was it was more observation than anything. But you have to understand these Gramercy Tavern and Per Se were at that point were the only two other kitchens I had ever experienced the inside of, apart from this bar and grill that I had worked at in suburbs in Toronto. So even just observing, you take on so much information, even like learning that what you thought was a shallot brunoise in school, is just nowhere near a shallot brunoise for Thomas Geller.
So that difference in this bar and grill in Toronto versus what you saw in a pretty well-known famous restaurant like Gramercy Tavern, like what was that kind of mind-blowing, or were you like, things are kind of the same?
No, it was completely different. There were different standards. The atmosphere of the kitchens was different. I mean, I think at the kind of restaurant like the one I started at, there was this general sentiment of like, I'm only here because I need the paycheck, and then I'm going to go do something else. There were a lot of people here at the restaurant who were like, I'm trying to get myself through school, and like they had an end goal in mind that didn't have anything to do with a restaurant. And then to speak with people who were at per se in Gramercy Tavern, and their goal was like, I want to be sous chef, and every day they're trying to be better and trying to do a faster or higher quality job than the day before. It was like a completely different world and a completely different mindset that it took me a lot of getting used to, because you can read the French Laundry cookbook front to back like hundreds of times, like I did in my youth, but to go to the place and to see someone slicing chives as if it was the most important thing, that was a very inspiring moment. And it's like a gut check at that point, right? You kind of understand, like, do I believe that this is something that I can apply myself to, or am I already having doubts? And if you're already having doubts, you kind of know that maybe this road isn't for you.
Yeah, so it wasn't so much stressful as it was a validator for you, seeing the passion and the craftsmanship and the dedication to that craftsmanship in these high-end restaurants in New York.
And especially like as young as I was, like I was 19, so I was younger than a lot of even the other students that I was in school with. A lot of the other interns at these restaurants, they were usually older than me. So probably because of my age as well, they didn't give me a lot of responsibility. Like it was at no point in the time I was at either of these restaurants did the fate of service hang on my shoulders. Like it was, I was put on the amuse bouche section, and I was making a pomme d'arfan and things like that. Like it wasn't like I was on the meat roast doing something that a mistake would cost a lot of money and a lot of time.
So that trajectory, you go to the 6-month training, you're working in these restaurants. What's then the trajectory to get to Noma?
All right. So after school, I went back to Toronto. I worked at what was arguably one of the best restaurants in the country in Canada. It was called Splendido at the time. It's no longer open. And I was there for just over a year before getting an internship at Mugaritz in San Sebastian, or just outside San Sebastian.
In the Basque Country, which is, by the way, one of my favorite places in the world for food. You're making some of the great stops, it sounds like, early on.
Yeah, it was. I at the time I was working in the restaurant in Toronto, I had Sundays off. So Sundays I would work at a bookstore it was a 5-hour shift. It was a store that only sold cookbooks. And I remember the Mugaritz cookbook coming out, and you spend a lot of time flipping through pages at a store like that. And that was one of the places that really resonated with me, and I applied for an internship. He came to Toronto on a book tour, and I got to speak to him in person, and he sort of said, "This is my email, should be an email. My assistant will set you up."
Amazing.
So then I did 11 months at Mugaritz as an intern.
Did you fall in love with San Sebastian?
Yes, I'm still in love with San Sebastian. It's my second home. Ironically, Toronto is not my first home. I feel more at home in Copenhagen now than Toronto, but that's a story for another time.
And so after 11 months in San Sebastian, what happened after that?
And then I finished there. I had to go back to Toronto because my internship visa ended, and I was applying for jobs in the States. I was looking at both Benu in San Francisco and Grace in Chicago. I got offers from both of them. I chose to go with Grace, Curtis Duffy's restaurant. And the immigration process to get to the States, despite what I thought was a very strong resume, and despite sinking a lot of my life savings into legal fees and lawyers and applications and things like that, after about 7 months, they denied my entry visa.
Oh my
so
gosh.
I had to pass on the offer from Curtis Duffy. And, I actually ended up, because for 7 months, it was like any day now, right? Like that's how it works. Is it's kind of like waiting for a package from UPS. It says it's in transit, and then one day it'll say, okay, delivered or
Canceled.
yeah. And, so that's what happened was like I was living out of a suitcase because I was like, any day I'm going to have to get on a plane. And then it got canceled, and I applied for a Danish working holiday visa, and I got that visa 2 days later. And then I flew to Copenhagen for the first time. This is 2014, just before they did their Tokyo pop-up at Noma. I did a month at Noma as an intern because I moved to Copenhagen in July, which I didn't know every restaurant closes in July for vacation. So not only had I spent all of my savings previously trying to work in the States, but I had now moved to one of the most expensive countries in the world with no prospect of a job for at least the first 30 days. So I begged some mutual friends at Noma to let me just go and preserve some oregano flowers and things like that in exchange for staff meals, so I wouldn't go completely broke. I ended up spending 7 months in Copenhagen. I only did 1 month at Noma. I decided that after Mugaritz, I didn't want to work in another large restaurant with a very large internship contingent. And I wanted something that's smaller.
And even with their reputation at that point, they've won best restaurant in the world like multiple times. You're like, I only want to do it for a limited time for now.
Yeah, it was one of the, like, I'd just come from a rest, like Mugaritz number 3 in the world. So I had been part of that world
for a while,
for a year. And, there's a lot of, it's almost like being in a machine. Like your role is, to work together with a very large group of people to make impossible tasks seem only difficult. But in doing so, you almost lose sight of the bigger picture because you're so focused on the small details and making sure that everything fits just perfectly that, sometimes you miss cooking a piece of meat from start to finish, because now at Mugaritz, you would butcher the meat, you'd hand it off to the guy on the grill, he would cook it, he'd hand it back to you, you'd carve it, you'd give it to the guy who was plating, he would plate it, then there would be a sauce from someone else to go on the plate. And sometimes you miss working in a kitchen where you cook the piece of meat, you rest it, you do something else, it's finished resting, you carve it, and you put it on the plate, and then you have a sauce to go with it. Like, I wanted something a bit smaller. I wanted to have my hands on more components.
More of the process?
Yeah. So I ended up taking a position as a pastry chef at a restaurant called Almanac, which doesnn't exist anymore, but some notable, there's two
that seems to be a trend there.
Yeah. I'm the Grim Reaper of restaurants. Two of the guys I was working with, the head chef of Almanac was Nick Curtin, who now has the 1-star Alouettes in Copenhagen. And the sous chef, who I worked with, was Eric Vildgaard, who has the 3-star Jordnær in Copenhagen right now as well. So it was like a very casual restaurant that we were working in, but some of the guys I worked with went on to do really great things with their careers. So there was definitely something said of just the pedigree of people working at that one point in time. So I did 7 months as their pastry chef there, and I got called back to Toronto because one of the chefs, the chef de cuisine of the very first restaurant I worked at after culinary school in Toronto, Splendido, he was opening his own restaurant, and it was a very Ocean's 11 moment because when I left that restaurant, a lot of other chefs left and went international as well. So some people went to 11 Madison Park, or they went to Paris and went to Clamato. All these great restaurants around the world at a time where in Canada it was very difficult to reach that level of pedigree in terms of restaurants because the restaurant scene hadn't developed as high as it is now. So it was this very Ocean's 11 moment where he was calling all of us and sending us all emails saying, hey, I want to do this thing. We're going to go for a star. We're going to go for the 50 best list in Toronto. Are you in? And I told the chef at Almanac, I told Nick, I was like, look, I got to go and I got to go take care of this. So he brought us all back to Toronto. We opened this restaurant called Alo, and we were the number 1 restaurant in Canada within 14 months.
Amazing.
And they currently have a Michelin star and we were on the 100 best restaurants list or something like that around the time where I left. So I did 4 years at this restaurant, and then decided that I wanted to do something different, and then the opportunity with Noma came up, and that's how I ended up at Noma.
So that going to a brand new restaurant from the scratch, I mean, and watching like the bear, like it's like that early moment. It's like you talk about this Ocean's 11 bringing together the team and everyone has their specialty. I imagine it's a pretty exciting time.
Yeah, it was very exciting. It was also, this is like right before social media kind of became a thing, and we were this small, like 40-seat restaurant on the 3rd floor of an old building that no one really paid attention to, with no street presence. There was no signage. So it was a little bit like the rumor mill around the city. It was like, oh, Patrick Chris is opening a tasting menu restaurant. And there were a lot of doubters at the beginning, because at that time there weren't a lot of tasting menus in Toronto. It was almost it was a place we were going through the small plates movement. Have you been here before? We recommend 7 to 9 plates per person, shared plates, charcuterie boards and things like that. So to make the jump into very high-end fine dining, like when you sit down, you're offered a choice of 3 different colors of napkins, like black, gray, and white, depending on what color pants you're wearing, so that the lint from the napkin doesn't show up on your pants. Like small kind of service things like that. Or like when we offered cheese, it would be cheese for 2 guests, and we talk to the cheesemonger in Toronto and say, what's the small wheel that's the most overripe right now that you're having trouble selling? Because we'll take the whole wheel and we give the guests the full wheel of cheese with some jams, some spreads, and then 3 to 4 different types of crostini and crunchy things. And as soon as you're about halfway through, the server will come by and take it away and give you fresh, like you'll get refreshed, warm bread and warm crisp. Like the service was such a big part, of this restaurant. And it was because in our minds, we said, why couldn't this restaurant that we were opening be as good as some of the greatest restaurants that you hear about in the world? And a lot of us had gone from Toronto and worked at a lot of these amazing restaurants around the world. And then, the opportunity to come back and push, and, it wasn't easy at the beginning. There were days where, we did 12 guests, but eventually word of mouth started to spread. We got our first reviews in, and they were all very favorable. I don't think we missed a star in any of the reviews. They were all perfect scores. And then it was like, we're fully booked, and it's on.
That moment when you have the reviewers coming in, do you know it? And is it like a little bit of extra stress that day? What's that like?
Yeah, it's a couple of the reviewers, the critics in Toronto, we knew what they looked like. And then there were others that, like Ruth Reichel, I remember, she showed up, like booked under her name and showed up, and a lot of the cooks didn't know who she was because they weren't at that stage where they were reading the New York Times several years earlier and her reviews or her writing and things like that. But there was a handful of us who were freaking out because Ruth Reichel is a huge deal, that she's coming to Toronto and she's going to eat at this restaurant, and we've been open for 4 months, and what the hell's going on? Like, why is she here? Or like Gordon Ramsay came in one time and like just sat in the dining room, and we're like, how is this happening? It was almost surreal, because we were just this group of ragtag cooks who wanted to do something cool and wanted to really push and see how far we could take creativity. And like, I remember staff meal used to be, when we made rooster stock for like a jus and for reduction, you pick all the meat off and you eat the meat for staff. Like we weren't spending luxury money on anything. It was like, let's just see how far we go in gumption.
When you learned about the star, what's that like? What's the news like in the kitchen in the restaurant?
So, Alo didn't get a star until I think 2 or 3 years after I had left the restaurant, because Canada didn't have a Michelin guide. But
got it. Okay.
I remember they announced Michelin was coming to Toronto, and I stayed up until some obscene hour, like 3 a.m. to watch the ceremony live. And I remember when they announced that Alo had gotten a star, and I still had friends who worked there. So of course I was, 4 a.m, I'm frantically texting people just to say congratulations, because
that's amazing.
It is well deserved. Right? It's a restaurant that when it opened, it was a lot of people taking a big leap of faith and kind of believing that they could do something new and exciting and that people would come. it was very, very, field of dreams. If you build it, they will come.
So what ultimately pulled you back to Noma? You were there early in your career there for a short time, then you get pulled back. What did that?
So the reason I went back to Noma, was not so much to be at the number one restaurant in the world. Like at the time they were unranked as well because they had closed the old location and they had just opened 2.0 in the new location. So when you move locations, for the 50 best restaurants guide, they automatically dock your entry because technically you've closed and reopened. So we were unranked and we had 2 stars, 2 Michelin stars. Notoriously, like people were like, how does Noma only have 2 stars? But it wasn't like I was trying to go to the best restaurant in the world. I saw Noma as more than a restaurant, and it's kind of foreshadowing here because I saw Noma as a brand, as a place that you could stand and your voice would be heard by more people than any other restaurant in the world. And I've told a brief rendition of my story to you today, and you can kind of see how I've relied a lot upon restaurants for a sense of purpose, for a sense of family ties and camaraderie, especially in the early going when trying to convince my parents that this is what I wanted to do when things were a bit rocky at home. So I felt that I owed the industry something for what it's given me, and Noma provided me the soapbox with which that I could use the tools provided to me by this restaurant to try to improve the industry for the people who come after me. And it was like a sense of responsibility because this industry had given so much and provided so much to me that it was, to me, the right point in my life where I wanted to do something like that. And that's what I've been doing for almost 6 years. Or at least trying to.
In the world of fine dining and culinary world, people know Noma because they've just won so many awards. But they broke through a little bit to the kind of the public consciousness with, I think, In the Bear because of the trips that are made there in that show. But why do you think it is so well known? Why does it stand for more than just, hey, the best restaurant in the world? Why is it so symbolic in that way?
I think there's something very punk rock about Noma. Very indie in that it started in 2003 as a result of Scandinavia basically declaring that, look, our best restaurants are French. They do French food and turbot and caviar, and it's great, but like, what do we have to express time and place, which has become kind of a cliche, but time and place, of Scandinavia, Denmark and Finland and Sweden. And so we're going to open this restaurant called Noma, which is a short form of Nordic mal, which is Nordic food in Danish. And we're going to use only things around us, use flavors that are local to home. And at the beginning, we don't care if no one shows up. This is like our declaration that, we believe that Nordic food can be on the same level as Italian and French and Japanese. And, 22 years later, you have where we are now, where Noma is like, there's people who don't know restaurants, don't work in the industry, and you say the word Noma to them, and like, oh, you mean that? Like, aren't they like number one in the world? Like, you mean that restaurant in Scandinavia that's like they serve reindeer moss and ants? And, like people, it's part of the zeitgeist now, right? Like, it's very almost like it's almost Nirvana, like how you start from like, like fighting the man, and like we just want to do our own thing and be as creative as possible and be as explosive and forward thinking as possible, to now like we're mainstream now, man. Like now people know who we are. People have like t-shirts with Noma on it and stuff like that.
And I think the founder basically said you have to evolve or you die, in a sense. And so I think that's what you guys did. You took a big leap, at the end of this year, and you guys are essentially becoming a products company and a little bit of a lab, more of a lab than just a big high-end restaurant, right?
Yeah, and that's part of the thinking of when you're a restaurant, you're really only able to affect the lives of the amount of people you can fit into your dining room and who can eat your food, right? Like, you can make the argument that people who have never eaten at Noma, they are fans of ours, even though they've only seen the photos in the cookbook or read the literature in the cookbook. But in an actual effective standpoint, unless you eat at Noma, we're not really changing anyone's perspectives on things. So in what we're doing now with this evolution, it's the equivalent of releasing albums or going on tour with these pop-ups, right? Like we're able to democratize the experience of Noma by either geographically taking it to different parts of the world and changing the experience, or with our line of products from Noma projects, which, it's not like you're getting the 16-course Noma tasting menu at home, but we're able to take some of these flavors that are endemic to Noma, put them into a bottle, and then and share them with people who might not ever have the chance to eat in our dining room. So it's like buying an album, right? Like, it's not like seeing Jagger live, but you can still listen to Satisfaction and tap your foot and tap your fingers along with the beat, and you're still affected by some semblance of experience.
Does this transition towards products allow you to more effectively scale the ethos of what you guys believe? Maybe there's like certain flavors you want to platform, or I know that you guys care about sustainability and, hey, how do we make fine dining more sustainable? So does this transition, putting more things to more people's hands worldwide, allow you to platform some of your ideals more?
Yeah, for sure. One of the biggest kind of ideals that we believe in, and you can kind of tell from the staff meals that we eat at the restaurant, is you can eat, like, we're not telling people to eat vegetarian, but we're trying to encourage people to eat more vegetables. And so if you look at the product line of things we've released through Noma projects, it's mostly almost completely plant-based. Like, there's a little bit of katsuobushi here and there, but for the most part, the idea is that you can use these products where we've used things like koji and fermentation to create umami and to make a more satisfying experience. And you can add it to something like a blanched cabbage and really elevate something that's more mundane at home, to try to close the gap between the steak dinner where you have like a very satisfying piece of meat, and also just the everyday meal where you don't necessarily have to splurge with that amount of money or that costly environment in order to feel satisfied.
Talk a little bit about what you guys have been doing around your pop-ups. I connected with you in Japan, and you had connected with one of the Spoon Team, Tiffany, on a fermentation tour, which is a really cool. I mean, how cool is that? A fermentation tour in Japan, but you're working obviously with the fermentation, and then you did this pop-up. Talk a little bit about the Japan project.
Yeah, so Japan. So I've now done two pop-ups in Kyoto. I was not at Noma, the pop-up previously, which was Mexico, which I'm now subjected to hearing stories about Mexico from my coworkers who were there. Yeah. But I relish the pop-up experience, and there's people who, when you take them out of their element, they're uncomfortable, and they're not able to get the engine going the way it would hum at home. And then there's people who anticipate the challenge and they're excited for it, and they like that there's a little bit of unknown and a little bit of danger. And I think that's the team at Noma is, for so many of us, the first time in Kyoto was our first time in Japan. For me, it was my first time in Asia. I had never been to Asia before. I've been in the back of my mind, it's like when you look like I do, and being of Cantonese background, and you don't speak any of the languages, it's very intimidating to go to some of these countries where it can be assumed that I speak the language, and then when the locals find out that you don't, it's kind of like they don't know how to categorize you and they don't know how to treat you. So there was this kind of uneasiness in the back of my mind. But when you go to Japan with 100 people, and so many of them are from different parts of the world, and you kind of experience the immersion into a completely new culture together, the effect that has on the team building, on the interpersonal connections, but also on the inspiration of, when you go to these different parts of the world, you can be interested in whatever you want. You can say, look, I want to spend my days off learning how to brew sake, or I want to spend my day off knowing what it's like to walk in a Zen temple and to have it be completely silent around me. And it's an exercise in mental creativity in that you're almost always on high alert in terms of the synapses in your brain firing, because there's so much new stimulus and there's so many things to think about, and there's the language is different. And do I want to learn Japanese? Do these people speak English? It was so much all at the same time, and I loved every moment of it. I had a packed schedule. I think the fermentation tour with Tiffany I had to cut short because I was also expected on another fermentation visit in another part of Japan, unfortunately. But that was me trying to cram as much as I could into this wonderful part of the world because there's so much, especially in fermentation. And I remember telling a colleague the other day, I was like, because they asked a similar question. They said, what was so exciting about Japan? And I said, the idea that someone has been making soy sauce longer than I'm from Canada, which was founded in 1867, longer than my country has been in existence, is so wild to me. It's so wild that like when this guy's great grandfather first mixed soybeans and water and salt, there was nothing.
Crazy.
Where I'm from. There was like herds of buffalo and Native American peoples, but the civilization that I come from did not exist.
I visited sake factories, and you meet like the 5th generation owner, and the factory's older than your country, or just about as old as it is. Absolutely crazy. Obviously, Noma's birth was born around this idea of really elevating Denmark's kind of culinary history and making a statement there. But when you go somewhere and do a pop-up in a place like Japan, how do you then elevate the place you're going to and the traditions there?
So I think, and I can only speak for my experience with them because they've been doing pop-ups at Noma before I started, but what they maintained back then and what I maintain with the pop-ups that I was part of is that the pop-up is a failure if you go to Japan and you make Japanese food, because that's not our strength. There are people in Japan doing better Japanese food than we will probably ever get to do. So the way we want to approach it is we go with an open canvas, and we soak up as much of the culture as we can, and we don't try to understand the recipe of how they make something, but we want to understand the story behind why they make it, right? The history behind a lot of dishes. The first pop-up in Japan, our opening course was called a hasun, and it's an offering during the procession of a kaiseki meal that is one of the most historic components of the meal, and it's a celebration of the micro season. So products that are in season at that very moment, presented artfully, elegantly, in different cooking, like different components are cooked differently, and it's probably like 6 or 7 different things on this presented platter to you. And if you were to go back to this restaurant a week later, it would be different. And that was something that really resonated with us, because with the importance of the seasons in Japan and kind of seeing that it was so important to this component of the culture that this is something that they would change every micro season that they would have. We were like, how could we not have that be our opening course? And it goes like, that's one easy example, but then there were countless other small things that we did. Like I made a miso out of corn from Hokkaido, which in Japan, miso classically is made with soybeans, rice koji, and salt. So for me to take a technique that we developed at Noma, which was making misos from things apart from cooked legumes, we would take the koji, that was usually fresh koji, and we dehydrate it. And we dehydrate it because when you remove the water component of the koji, it allows you to use something that has a higher hydration than a cooked soybean. So you could do something like dry the koji and then mix it with fresh like pureed corn. And the dried koji would soak up all that extra moisture. So self-mediate, and then would have the texture of miso, and then you would add the appropriate amount of salt, and you could make a miso that had the characteristics of fresh corn or of fresh bell peppers or fresh tomato. And it was really unique to us, and to be able to use Japanese corn in a technique that we were working with in Copenhagen, and then serve it on the menu to guests who were Japanese, was like a really cool completing of the circle that was really inspiring.
So you are essentially spending a lot of your time now helping to think of new ideas. Talk about your day-to-day now. Like, you're back in Copenhagen. What are you doing for Noma?
So my day-to-day right now, it changes by day. Obviously, I'll start my day. I'll go to Noma. Sometimes I start at Noma projects. Maybe some people aren't aware that they're in 2 separate facilities, but they're maybe 5-minute bike ride from each other. So
Noma projects versus the restaurant?
Yes, exactly. If it's a big production day at Noma projects where we have to make 800 liters of amazake or something like that, then I'll start projects and make sure things are going smoothly there. I'll transition over to the restaurant. I'll check in with the guys there. And they're usually the first half of the day we're doing production for the restaurant. So whether that's making misos and soy sauces for the current menu, making kombuchas, making koji, it's usually the first 6 or 7 hours of the day are spent making sure that we can keep up with the pars. And then once that finishes and service opens for the restaurant, then all the kind of the hustle and bustle of the restaurant is kind of focused in the dining room and in the service kitchen area. It's a bit more serene on our end of the building. And that's when we really open up for the research and development part of our day, where it's longer term projects. Sometimes it's working with byproducts from the tasting menu, things like if we're using beets on the menu. What do you do with the beet peels? Is there something you can do that's cool? We make a lot of dashi, so is there something we can do with the kombu? Because the amount of dashi we make, it creates a lot of spent kombu, and there's only so much braised kelp that we can eat for staff meal. So to try to find something to do where it's enhancing and making something a bit more delicious, that's an ongoing challenge with whatever byproducts that the restaurant produces.
Your R&D though is longer term, creating something that may ultimately show up on the dining experience in the restaurant, or may be something that you productize through projects and becomes like a consumer package product.
Yeah, and a lot of times those are one and the same. The products that we sell through Noma projects, I'd say the vast majority of them, I think the only ones that we never used in the restaurant were the corn yuzu hot sauce, and there's like one more, but the rest of them are all things that are part of the pantry at Noma. And that's usually how these products begin is, we'll create ferments for the restaurants, and we'll be experimenting, and then they'll end up using it on the menu. They end up liking it. And then we say, look, is there a possibility that this is something that people would, like to cook with at home? And for things like that, one of the first steps we do is we have this subscription service called the Taste Buds membership. And this is a yearly subscription where we let people sign up, and
very cool.
They have these every few months they have a drop of these products that we're not sure if they're going to sell to the general public, or maybe we think they're really cool, but we don't have the capacity to make them by the hundreds of thousands of liters. But for 2,000 people, a small bottle, like that's completely feasible, and it allows us to kind of crowdsource opinions and see how people are liking things. It's been a great experience. We have a Discord channel that they're all part of. Oh, wow.
It's your true fans. Like, it's your true fans in an early kind of alpha or beta testing your products.
Yeah. And like, it's really cool to see people not only using our products, but then they'll start talking about like, oh, I also make this miso. And then, the fermentation channel is just all these really clever people who, not to say that, they're amateurs or anything, but when you look at anything through the eyes of, like, I do this professionally, right? So I have a certain perspective of everything that I do.
Yeah.
When you look through different eyes, these people can see things that I would never see. So it's really cool to speak to them and to ask them questions and have them ask me questions, because it is like another channel of information.
The Spoon looks a lot at that intersection of food and technology. We look at things like automation and how it's used in food, increasingly AI and how that's used for like flavor development. Like going back 15 years, IBM was trying to use AI to do recipes. Now, like, I feel like everyone's trying it with ChatGPT. But where do you guys use technology? And do you have a general view of technology at Noma?
Luckily for us, and I say luckily just because I've been speaking to some of my peers in the industry about their restaurants, and but luckily for us, Rene is very progressive minded. He's very interested in AI and what the future could bring and the growth of the industry that we call home. And I've heard that sometimes that's not the case in some restaurants. Some chefs are still very like, I don't know if it's intimidation that, are we all going to be replaced by machines, or is there not a belief that AI can help you develop a stronger recipe or help streamline your process. I remember, at the SKS where we met, I was speaking to, some people about AI, and it's interesting because in fermentation, a lot of it is math. It's chemistry and math, which are two parts of society that are quite old and very, very rich in terms of information and proof and what's the word? Like math is like 1+1 will always be 2. Like it's reliable.
So much of cooking is based in science, right?
Yeah. And one problem we have sometimes is when we're trying to be super creative, a lot of times what we do is we end up doing something for the first time. Like we can't find anyone else who's done anything but like this before. And one of the first things we have to figure out is what we did safe? Is what we did like, is this, we check all the boxes in our head, and based on our experience and what we as fermenters believe to be like the right amount of salt, the right amount of pH, the right, is it anaerobic or is it aerobic? How much water activity involved? Like we check all the boxes, but, to me, it's kind of like you want to build this new car, but you're taking components of all of like Lamborghini and a Ferrari, but also a Ford F-150 and a VW Beetle. And you're taking all these components from all the different ones because that's the best of each component. You put it together to one like weird looking car that no one else has ever made before. And for us, the only way to figure out if the car runs is to turn the key. And with AI, I'm like, well, wouldn't it be great if AI was able to analyze all this math and all this chemistry and say, look, the numbers check out. Like this is not, I don't want to say guaranteed safe, but like it's nice to have information at your fingertips that can be a reinforced when you're all alone in the dark creating something new and you're like, I wish someone had done this before. Like I want to type into Google and there's one result and someone did this before and they're like, this is how you do it. And I'm like, okay, we're on the right track. But in the industry of creativity, a lot of times you find yourself as the one who's
pioneering. You're on the bleeding edge.
Yeah, exactly.
Breaking things. You're an inventor in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Last question, because someone who makes their living and is, from early on rebelled a little bit against your parents and you're at the highest kind of place you could be in terms of culinary. When you have some time off and you're in your own kitchen, what is your favorite like cooking gadget, or do you, or is it like the cobbler's kids have no shoes? You just don't cook when you're at home, right?
So it's funny because in Toronto, I never cooked at home. I was like, I feel like Uber Eats must have supported those 4 years just off of what I bought off.
Which makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense, right?
And then I came to Noma, and I don't know if it was because I was so far removed from cooking in a professional kitchen, but I started to cook a lot at home. And when people ask me like what I cook at home, my answer is always it depends on what I feel like eating. But there is a constant is that I don't use like chicken wing garum. I don't use beef garum at home. I don't bring any of the stuff from work home to cook with. And I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized it's because it's almost, to me, it almost feels like cheating. Like you've created the perfect ferment for this specific, dish that you're making. And I want to, and it makes it taste better. It makes like a beef jus taste beefier with beef garum in it. But I kind of miss the old school of like, I just want a regular beef jus with my steak. I try to cook old school at home without any of the gadgetry that I have at work, which is quite a surprise to a lot of people.
That's interesting. Do you have a favorite kitchen gadget at home? Are you using a Thermomix or like an Instant Pot or just your oven?
I mean, I'm very old school. So I have a Lodge cast iron. I bought a wok in Japan, in Kyoto, for the first time we went for the pop-up.
Oh, very cool.
One of my things over the pandemic while we were closed was I realized that my background is Cantonese, but my parents were born in Toronto. I was born in Toronto. Like I don't speak the language. And I realized that Chinese cuisine is so rich, and I've been so interested in Japanese cuisine and Japanese traditions, and I'm like, Chinese, Cantonese traditions are like, they're right there. And for some reason, I was not studying them. So during the pandemic, I started reading into like traditional Chinese recipes, how they build a recipe, ferments that they use in their culture. I read all of Fuchsia Dunlop's books, just to try to reconnect with that part of my heritage, which I had worked at French restaurants, Italian restaurants, Spanish restaurants. The thought never ever occurred to me that Chinese food was anything that would dignify my career. And then it just so happens that after reading about it and learning fermentation, you realize how deep these cultures are. So I bought a wok in Japan, and I've been using that a lot. Realizing even though I have a gas burner, which is a rarity in Copenhagen and the land of induction stovetops, I am able to use it to some effectiveness. I feel like I've still got a lot to learn, and all the YouTube videos I watch of the wok masters definitely reinforces that idea.
This has been a lot of fun, Kevin. I really appreciate Kevin Jeung. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, that's my conversation with Kevin Jeung, who's helping to bring the world's most famous restaurant into the future. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. We'd really appreciate it. Rate and review it. You can find it in Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And speaking of podcasts, if you haven't checked out the new podcasts we have as part of the new Spoon Podcast Network, go to Spoon, click podcasts, and check them out. All right, folks, that's it for now. We'll talk to y'all soon.
If you enjoyed this episode, why not share it with a friend? And don't forget to give us a 5-star review. You'll find more content like this on thespoon.tech/podcasts.